Years ago, I was at the beach with my 6-year-old nephew, Jason. We were frolicking around, and at one point, I reached for him and I said, "Here, Jason, let me throw you in the water." And he immediately said, "No!" So I said, okay, I won't throw you in the water. But now he didn't want to play anymore. He didn't want me to go near him. So I said, "Jason, I promise I won't throw you in the water." But even though we've known each other all his life and love each other very much, he wasn't buying it. At that moment, we were face to face with the trust problem. It's often said that you can't negotiate without trust. But God forbid that's true. Because if it is true, then peace accords, international joint ventures, internet transactions, and many other things with strangers would be impossible. Think about it. Most of the conflicts and difficult negotiations we face in life require us to deal with people we're not completely sure about, or require others to deal with us when they're not sure about us. In each of these situations, we face something I will call the trust problem. The trust problem goes like this. How do I know I can rely on your assurances and that it's safe to deal with you? That was the question my nephew Jason was asking at the beach, and unless we found a way to solve it, the fun was going to be over. And our experience illustrates that it isn't only strangers and enemies who grapple with the trust problem. Even in the closest relationships, the trust problem can suddenly appear. The trust problem is a very big deal. In 2008, when Wall Street firms like Lehman Brothers collapsed as the housing bubble burst, a great wave of doubt and uncertainty swept over the financial markets around the world. Lenders and investors asked, how do I know that I can rely on borrowers' assurances and that it's safe to deal with them? That trust problem caused $50 trillion to evaporate from the world economy in a few months, one of the largest single losses of wealth in human history. But it gets even worse. In 1984, a famine devastated North Ethiopia, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Incredibly, though, there actually was sufficient food in southern Ethiopia to feed everyone. Part of the problem was drought and war, but these alone didn't account for the famine's devastation. The thing that was stopping the grain from getting there was a trust problem. Apparently, there'd been a history of among traders of bad dealing in false goods. We can imagine stories of sawdust or cheaper grains winding up in grain sacks. Worried about such risks, the grain traders had a lumbering solution. Check every bag. The grain would move from farm to market, and as it did, distrust drove every grain distributor along the way to routinely open every grain sack, pour its contents on the ground, and cull through the pile to make sure that the grain was good. This scene played out again and again roughly every 20 miles in every negotiation, badly delaying shipments and sending prices beyond the reach of the starving. Once you start to understand the trust problem, you see it everywhere. It's a basic part of the human condition, a fundamental dilemma that's particularly present when we negotiate, and which therefore accounts for much of the reason why negotiation is literally not leisure. If I trust you, your counterpart thinks, you may take advantage of me. But if I don't trust you, I may miss a good opportunity. Fortunately, though, there's a vast array of ways to cope with and overcome trust problems in negotiations. In a sense, we've been grappling with the trust problem throughout our course. One of the best ways to cope with the trust problem is to use interest-based bargaining. As we saw in session 1, being hard on the problem, soft on the person can help you build trust. It lets you show the other person that your ideas will serve her interests too. More than once, peace in the Middle East has come about with the help of interest-based bargaining. We've also seen in other sessions the importance of building credibility by building rapport and personal relationship, by using words thoughtfully and respectfully, by actively listening, appealing to common interests, and intentionally empathizing with the other person. Each of these things tends to build trust and connection between negotiators. But truth be told, I didn't use any of these things at the beach with Jason to solve our trust problem. I used something very different. Instead, I said this, Jason, I promise I won't throw you in the water, and if I do, I'll give you $10. Immediately, he brightened and said, "Okay," and we were back to frolicking and playing just as we had before. What solved the trust problem? I offered Jason a trust mechanism. A trust mechanism is any arrangement that reassures you when you're not sure that you can rely on the other person's assurances alone. It's any option or instrument that allows one person to say, in effect, "I'm not sure I can just rely on what he says, but if I can also have X, I'll feel safe enough to deal with him." In my case, the $10 I offered Jason served as an incentive for him and a penalty for me. If I broke my promise, I would immediately lose something and he would immediately gain. Now, I could have offered him another trust mechanism instead. For example, I could have said, "Jason, let's ask the lifeguard to watch me and make sure I don't throw you in the water." Or I could have said, "Jason, I'll promise your mother that I won't throw you in the water, and then she'll promise you that I won't." Now, this is a very simple, pleasant story. But what difference do trust mechanisms make in the rough and tumble world of adults? Let's consider what role they play when trust is harder to find than at any other time in human relations, in time of war. In her remarkable book, Peacetime, my colleague at Columbia, Professor Paige Fortna, explored a simple and profound question. Does a peace treaty ever really work? Or is it just a piece of paper? And let's face it, there's good reason to be skeptical. In war, truth is the first casualty, and who is more untrustworthy than a wartime enemy? In mid-1945, Joseph Stalin led the Japanese to believe he was seriously interested in negotiating with them. Then, having learned much and having distorted their expectations, he declared war on them. And of course, Adolf Hitler abrogated the infamous Munich Pact with Britain within months after signing it, and later broke his infamous pact with Russia, too. So do peace talks and peace treaties really work? To answer that question, Fortna studied literally every ceasefire agreement and peace accord negotiated by warring countries since 1945. The answer was that peace treaties work much more often than you might normally expect. Surprisingly, she found that the more serious the conflict, the more detailed the peace accord. That alone is surprising. In a bitter battle, why would negotiators work so hard on a document they have every reason to be skeptical about? It turns out that it was precisely because of their trust problems that negotiators poured more time and attention into the terms. And it turns out that specific kinds of terms in peace treaties tended to work better than others. For example, demilitarized zones and phased withdrawals to the original borders matter a lot. Credible peacekeepers, joint commissions, and third-party guarantors can help too. In each case, the terms that mattered the most were trust mechanisms. The Northern Ireland Peace Accords is a case in point. That agreement, signed by 8 parties after over 2 years of up and down negotiations, contained over a dozen different types of trust mechanisms. Talk about a belt and suspenders approach. But those trust mechanisms shored up confidence, giving the parties arrangements to rely on when they couldn't rely on each other's promises alone. So let's take a closer look at trust mechanisms. And there are 4 basic kinds: watching solutions, incentives and penalties, bridges, and formalized relationships. Watching solutions are arrangements that let you keep an eye on the other person so that you can see whether he's being truthful and whether he's acting well or badly. Watching solutions are ways to retain partial control or to make the conduct of the other person visible, accountable, and clear. These include clear rules and boundaries, early warning mechanisms, reporting requirements, disclosure and due diligence, monitors, phased withdrawals, and power-sharing arrangements. At the beach with my nephew Jason, if I'd asked the lifeguard to watch me, I would have been offering a watching solution. Peace treaties often rely on them extensively. Demilitarized zones, satellite reconnaissance, weapons inspections, and the like are all examples. And loan agreements. In loan agreements, lenders typically require extensive disclosure, documentation, due diligence, and often hire trustees to monitor the borrower's performance. As we'll discuss in more detail later, one of the great one of the great near disasters in recent diplomatic history, turned on a failure to insist on watching solutions. The European Union permitted Greece to join based on false assurances that Greece was financially sound. That mistake led to the near ruinous Greek debt crisis of 2010. Why didn't EU representatives insist on due diligence to confirm Greece's financial claims? As one former EU negotiator explained, he and his delegation were suspicious, but they felt it would have been impolite to ask. A second category of trust mechanisms includes incentives and penalties. These are carrots and sticks that encourage cooperation. That's what I offered Jason. Other examples include incentive compensation and bonuses, competition in markets, mutually assured destruction, collateral, and of course, threats of violence. Not that I recommend using that last one, except in self-defense. One of the more intriguing and non-obvious penalties is a solemnizing gesture. You know, things like cross my heart and hope to die, which means the promise maker is staking much of his social standing and credibility on his promise. Signers of the Declaration of Independence didn't just sign the document, they pledged to each other our sacred lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute. When you gave a trust mechanism to Jason, you just gave him another promise. Why should he have believed that promise any more than he believed the first one? And that's the curious thing about trust mechanisms generally. Very often, they themselves are little more than promises. I promise you a bonus. I promise to allow inspectors across our border. I promise to post collateral. But Fortna's research about peace treaties bears out what I witnessed with Jason. The promise of a trust mechanism very often strengthens the agreement for both sides in ways that a mere promise to behave doesn't. A third type of trust mechanism is a bridge, the use of intermediaries that can fill the trust gap. These are things or people both sides trust. Bridges allow you to say, I don't trust you, but I do trust Bob, and if he can lend us credibility in some way, I may be willing to cooperate. A bridge can help confirm that the deal is fair or reliably support one's promise to the other. We've encountered some examples of bridges before when we looked at independent criteria, that is, fair benchmarks. Other bridges include sponsors, references, insurers, and guarantors. My personal favorite in this category is something we can call a trust bridge. In 1950, a businessman named Francis McNamara found himself short of cash during a business lunch at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Knowing the waiter wouldn't accept his promise to pay the next day, McNamara had to call his wife to bring money and save him. The experience inspired McNamara. The following year, his company introduced Diners Club, the world's first modern credit card. In the industry, that legendary meal is now known as the First Supper. A credit card is a simple trust bridge. The diner makes a promise to pay money to his credit card company, which simultaneously makes a promise to pay almost the same amount to the restaurant. Now the restaurant can cheerfully do business with strangers who have no cash, relying not on their promises, but the promises of a trustworthy intermediary. A similar arrangement helped medieval traders. How could a Venetian clothing merchant safely buy wool from an English wool merchant? If the Venetian sent the gold first, he might never see the wool, and vice versa. If the Englishman sent the wool first, he might never see the gold. But by passing the money and the wool through trusted intermediary banks using something called a letter of credit, both sides could transact safely. In 2004, an expatriate former World Bank executive named Dr. Eleni Gebremedin came to Ethiopia seeking to solve the country's still serious food problem. In 2008, she introduced the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, which, among other things, acted as a trust bridge. Instead of trading directly with each other, grain traders now could buy and sell through the exchange, which would hold the grain in safe warehouses. The exchange ended traders' need to continually check the grain sacks, which helped dramatically increase farmers' income, reduce grain prices, and reduce hunger in one of the poorest nations on earth. It largely solved the trust problem, and in doing so, helped save millions from poverty and hunger. The last type of trust mechanism is formalized relationship. These are rules of engagement that guide our ongoing conduct. How was I able one evening, in the middle of Manhattan, to go up to a woman I didn't know, pull her close to me, hold her for several minutes, without her spraying mace in my face? Simple. My future wife and I were at a dance, and the dance rules functioned as rules of engagement. They reassured her, helping her know what touches were permissible and what each move signified. That's the power of formalized relationships. They spell out how we will interact and when. Often, they assure that we'll see each other again and again, further reducing the risk that any one encounter might raise. Examples include regularly scheduled meetings, charters, bylaws, alternative dispute resolution clauses, and clear discussion rules. I practiced corporate law for several years with major law firms in New York City, and I saw dozens and dozens of different kinds of complex agreements. Most of the terms and conditions in those contracts were trust mechanisms. In fact, once business people learn to identify trust mechanisms, they realize that they're the basic furniture of their transactional lives, and the same is true for you and me. How can you and I rent an apartment from a stranger in a strange city when the landlord doesn't know us at all? Of course, we could sign a lease, but legally enforcing an agreement is a slow, time-consuming, and expensive method. As we've seen, and will see, litigation is usually a last resort nuclear option. Typically, then, landlords and tenants rely on a host of trust mechanisms that work even without the court's help. Deposits, credit checks, guarantors, building supers who act as monitors, and perhaps 20 other formal and informal arrangements that shore up trust. As a negotiator, you can use trust mechanisms in several ways. If you're worried about the other negotiator, you can treat your concern as a legitimate interest and develop a list of possible trust mechanisms you'd like him to give you, each one of which is a creative option. That's what the European Union should have done with Greece. But as my story with Jason demonstrates, you can also offer trust mechanisms to bolster your own credibility. That's because they satisfy the other negotiator's interest in being reassured. If you think about it, you encounter these sorts of offers all the time in commercial life. Try it for 30 days free. Money back if not delighted. Try our low introductory rate. These are just a couple of simple trust mechanisms that merchants use to reduce consumer wariness. That is, to help solve the trust problem. To see how practical and important trust mechanisms are, let me ask you to do a thought experiment. Imagine you are a leading citizen of a developing country and that just became a nation a few years earlier. Things haven't been going well. Recently, a serious recession has hit the country's predominantly agricultural economy, and people are hurting and angry. In one province, angry, debt-ridden farmers have begun to turn to violence to stave off creditors and government officials who want to repossess their lands. The violence has begun to turn into insurrection. Mob rule has made that part of the province almost ungovernable, and the threat of revolt is rising in other provinces too. So the national legislature meets in emergency session, and representatives from every province promise that their provincial governments will contribute money to raise an army to put the insurrection down. And the representatives return to their home provinces, and nothing happens. Not a single region's government keeps its promise to pay a penny. So the insurrection grows. Finally, businessmen raise money to hire a private army to put the insurrection down. Like everyone else, the incident has scared the heck out of you. So you write a letter to your fellow leading citizens with a harsh message. This insurrection is a warning. The provinces simply can't keep their promises to each other, and that inability could mean the end of our nation. If we can't guarantee that we can put down violence, then we're dead. We've got to do something. And so you and about 6 other leaders meet to try to fix the problem. But what do? The story I just asked you to imagine is the story of the young United States in 1786, and you are James Madison. That year, Shays' Rebellion broke out in western Massachusetts, and the failure of the Congress to raise money to put it down was the triggering event that led to the Constitutional Convention the following year. It turns out the Constitution is firstly a response to a nearly ruinous trust problem, and as Madison's April 1787 letter put it, the number one problem with the then current government was, quote, failure of the states to comply. That is, they ain't doing what they said they'd do. If you read the U.S. Constitution, one of its most striking features is the way that it relies on a host of different trust mechanisms to assure that the states will comply. The key solution? A stronger federal government. But solving that trust problem raised a host of other trust problems, so that the challenge the negotiators faced was almost like a vast game of whack-a-mole. How could we have a strong national government without it becoming tyrannical? Madison and the Founding Fathers' answers was another set of trust mechanisms, power-sharing arrangements that they called checks and balances, where the president monitors and checks the Congress, Congress monitors and checks the president, the Supreme Court monitors and checks both, and is in turn somewhat monitored and checked by them. But even so, a strong national government raised other trust problems too. How could small states know that they wouldn't be dominated by bigger states? To solve that problem, the convention finally settled on another power-sharing arrangement. It created two houses of Congress. By giving smaller states increased voting power in the Senate, that deal gave small states a check on the decisions larger states shaped in the House of Representatives. So many trust problems, so many negotiable issues, but a huge trust problem remained. As George Mason, a leading anti-federalist, argued, how did the public know a strong federal government wouldn't destroy basic civil liberties? He refused to support the Constitution without a guarantee that there would be a Bill of Rights added to it. The Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791, sought to correct that trust problem. The Constitutional Convention was a highly complex multi-party negotiation in the shadow of an array of serious trust problems. It's a rich example of how vital trust problems can be in a major collaboration and how many different trust mechanisms may be important to solving them. But let's face it, trust mechanisms can feel overbearing. How would my wife have felt if the morning of our wedding I'd come to her and I'd said, "My sweet, I love you. If you'll just sign this simple 50-page prenuptial agreement, I know we'll have a wonderful life together." Chances are she would have balked and walked. "How can I marry you if you need something like that to feel safe with me?" she would have said. One implication, of course, is that we need to be careful not to overdo it with trust mechanisms. A number of studies have found that they can often weaken relationship, especially if we overuse them. If trust mechanisms are firm sources of trust, other methods we've explored in the course are soft sources of trust. These include listening, rapport building, empathizing, and the like. The relational costs that trust mechanisms sometimes impose make an additional case for using soft sources of trust. But in many cases, as we've seen, they're not sufficient. We need trust mechanisms too, but how can we use them without needlessly damaging the relationship? In his magisterial poem, Mending Wall, Robert Frost writes profoundly about the deep ambivalence we feel about trust mechanisms. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. When you first read that poem with negotiators' eyes, you first think it's a clear attack on trust mechanisms. Who wants walls and other paraphernalia that separate us from others? But it turns out that the narrator in the poem is the one who actually asks his neighbor to come help rebuild the wall. What's that all about? That, too, is the human condition. We need self-protection, but often and understandably, we don't want to admit that we want it. Are there ways, then, to use trust mechanisms gently? One way is to use trust mechanisms that do double duty, that serve other needs too. For example, in a simple transaction, the seller gives the buyer a copy of a receipt. One reason is to help each keep good accounts. The older and perhaps more hidden reason is that it protects each from saying the other failed to pay or deliver. In fact, some of the oldest writings we have are receipts that serve that very purpose. But because they're so familiar and have several uses, asking for a receipt is completely inoffensive. So it may be useful to look for trust mechanisms that are customary or multi-purposed: a form contract, a confirming email, payment by credit card, the custom of bringing the used car to a certified mechanic, and so forth, can help negotiators handle trust mechanisms in diplomatic and face-saving ways. For example, the European Union negotiators might have said to the Greek representatives, "Thank you for your candidacy for membership. Since it's traditional for all candidates to go through a standard due diligence process, we look forward to completing that process quickly with you and moving forward." But what if there was a way to use trust mechanisms that actually enhance the relationship? Is that possible? To answer that question, researchers ran a remarkable experiment. In one room, they asked randomly chosen subjects to play anonymous computerized trust games with each other in round-robin fashion. Very quickly, they began cheating each other, and by the end, there was no cooperation. Afterwards, most participants said they thought their counterparts were cheats and rogues. In another room, the researchers ran the identical experiment with another randomly chosen group of subjects with one small difference. Each computer screen had one of those little reputation reporting boxes like you find on eBay, showing how often your anonymous counterpart had cheated previously. Here, most everyone cooperated to the end of the game. Afterwards, most of these participants said that they thought their counterparts were good, trustworthy people. But then came the strange part. The researchers asked this second group, "Do you think that the reputation reporting box made any difference?" Now, you and I know that it clearly did. But the subjects didn't. No, they said, it didn't change anyone's behavior. It simply acted as a window revealing the actual character of the person I was playing with. In other words, this particular trust mechanism not only made the game much safer to play, it also enhanced the feeling of trust each player had for the others. I'll call arrangements like these solutions hiding in plain sight, or SHIPs. SHIPs are trust mechanisms that increase safety, but that are inoffensive and perhaps even capable of strengthening the relationship. They help protect and connect. We've actually seen a number of SHIPs already. Discussion rules are a simple example. When my wife and I agree to use the fair fight rule, that rule gives us a greater sense of safety that we can each talk without being invalidated or insulted or ignored. But because it opens up communication, it makes us both wind up feeling closer to each other. In that sense, all active listening has a similar quality. So too do partnering, reframing, independent criteria, and interest-based bargaining itself. How might we use SHIPs to help members of a beach house behave more reliably and feel closer to each other? We might invite them at the start of the summer to observe a simple house tradition that at a pre-summer dinner, after the main course, we spend 45 minutes over dessert and coffee working out some simple house principles. We might make it a tradition, too, to get the help of a broker or some other third party. If we handle it well, the process can be innocuous, fun, and fairly brief. An event that draws people closer together. But because it works out rules of the house, it can also offer additional protection. As we'll see in a later session, the construction industry has had remarkable success reducing litigation and improving collaboration using a more complex version of a similar process called partnering. It's a process that helps developers and builders connect better and protect themselves better. At the end of the beach house season, our group can happily say that the good feeling was due to the good nature of the residents and give no credit to that simple dinner meeting. That is, our SHIPs. That will be your and my secret. Whether or not we use SHIPs, there are some basic principles that can help us use trust mechanisms more effectively. First, the mending wall principle. Because, as Frost's poem suggests, we feel deep ambivalence about trust mechanisms, it's wise to be careful not to overuse them. In a peace treaty or a $100 million loan agreement, we may want to use a dozen or more. For lesser agreements, we may want just a couple. Second, the three-legged stool principle. Every kind of trust mechanism has its limits, so using several different kinds can improve the odds that one of them will work. In 1961, a U.S. bomber blew up over North Carolina, actually dropping a nuclear bomb. 3 different kinds of safety switches failed. The fourth and final safety switch worked, preventing nuclear catastrophe. We may need similar protections in our important deals. So a lender might negotiate for a watching solution, due diligence say, a penalty, repossess collateral, a bridge, a loan guarantor, and formalized relationship, regular meetings. In fact, most of these terms are the norm. Third, the principle of gradual escalation. The more coercive your agreement is, the greater the risk of costly conflict. Animals and nations know this. While they might fight to the death, they usually save that option as a last resort. Animals go through threat displays and ritualized fighting. Nations withdraw ambassadors and impose sanctions. For serious arm's-length agreements, it can be wise then to include trust mechanisms of different severity. For example, while lenders can repossess collateral, they often first prefer to ask for further assurances and perhaps impose an interest penalty. So how do you negotiate when trust is low? Often more hopefully and wisely than conventional wisdom suggests is possible. Yes, there are definitely times when no deal is the right answer, but not as often as you might think. You can use the soft sources of trust to build relationship. You can use the firm sources of trust mechanisms, to fill the gap. You can introduce trust mechanisms bluntly or discreetly. And you can use a special type, ships, to help you protect and connect. You've heard the African proverb Theodore Roosevelt made famous, speak softly and carry a big stick. In a sense, we've looked at both sides of that saying as we've looked at the soft and firm sources of trust. But in another sense, there's more to say because a big stick is more than a type of trust mechanism. It's also one possible source of leverage. Leverage is a big part of negotiation, a rich and subtle part. So there's a lot more to it than that old proverb suggests. So we'll look at that important subject in our next session.